Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and in today's video we're taking a look at setup adjustments in F1 Manager 2022. A good setup can make a pretty big difference in qualifying, and your position on the grid in turn makes a huge difference during the race alongside your setup. The impact of a good setup is felt throughout the race weekend, so with no time to waste and with timestamps down below as always, it's lights out and away we go. Practice structure. I discussed this in more detail in my previous video that I've linked in the pinned comment down below, so I'll keep it short here just to provide context for the rest of the video. Practice is split up into 3 60-minute long sessions over the course of the weekend, and it's an opportunity for your drivers to temporarily increase their attributes for the rest of the weekend by improving their familiarity with the track for up to 3 extra attribute points, their familiarity with the car for up to an additional 3 extra attribute points, and finally, for up to a whopping 9 extra attribute points, their confidence with their setup for the specific track. That last bit being the focus of our video today and the biggest contributor to the temporary increase to attribute points. Familiarity with the car goes up as your drivers drive around the track during practice, and it only drops when parts are replaced. This can happen between race weekends as well, so familiarity with the car actually carries over from race weekend to race weekend unless parts have been replaced, in which case it will drop. Track familiarity, meanwhile, increases while your drivers are driving around the track as well, but the longer they stay out for at a time, the faster it starts to climb. This is diametrically opposed to collecting feedback efficiently, because for that, you'll want to call your driver back to the garage as soon as they've got all 5 points of feedback to share, which means they're not staying out for as long, but it also means you're able to make tweaks to the setup and get further feedback to make even more tweaks. Balancing these two elements is a key aspect of practice, and with limited time spread across the 3 practice sessions, speed and efficiency play key roles during practice. And I'm not just talking lap times, something I'll clarify in just a moment. Finally, you also need to consider the fact that your reserve driver can only get a practice session in during the first of the 3 practice sessions. You'll want to occasionally dedicate some time to your reserve driver to make sure they're improving their skills too, especially if you intend to keep them for future seasons. But that means one of your drivers for the race is missing out on the opportunity to improve their track familiarity, their car familiarity, and their setup confidence. With the overall structure of practice discussed, let's turn our attention to collecting driver feedback and tweaking the setups accordingly. Before the weekend. It's important to remember that F1 racing is a team sport. Your drivers might feel like the stars of the show, but the people behind the cars matter just as much as the people inside them. First off, your race engineer plays a key role in getting feedback from your drivers faster. As stated earlier, these 5 points of feedback fill up one at a time as your driver drives around the track, and it's a representation of the conversation between your driver and the race engineer that they're paired with. So, the higher the engineer's feedback attribute is, the faster this will fill up to a full 5 pips, and the sooner you can call the car back in to make tweaks. With limited time on hand, the rate of collecting feedback can make a huge difference, so don't hesitate to scout for a replacement and hire one if need be. Then there is the team that's actually going to make the changes that'll make your driver feel more comfortable. If you take a look at your pit crew, you can see how good they are at various aspects of pit stops. Some of these attributes extend to changes made in the garage during practice and qualifying too. You can see, for example, how a better tire changes stat can reduce all pit stop times, and it can reduce the time it takes to make certain adjustments to the car. Again, time is limited, which means the faster your crew can make adjustments to the vehicle, the sooner it can go back out, and the faster it can come back in with additional feedback to apply. It's not a bad idea to prioritize pit crew training in these aspects if they're falling behind, but make sure you don't make too big of a sacrifice to your pit crew's ability to, say, operate a jack during the race just so they can make practice session adjustments a bit faster. Find the sweet spot between race day requirements and pre-race requirements and try to maintain your pit crew's capabilities across the board. Most importantly though, try not to let any one aspect fall too far behind, because that's when mistakes start to happen. Pre-session flight check. Any changes you make to the car during a practice session will cost you precious minutes, so you want to make sure you're minimizing the amount of time spent with suboptimal setups or tires. The first order of business is to pick your drivers. Are you sending your reserve driver out to gain some XP, or are you not? For the purpose of this video, let's say you're focused on your race drivers, and so let's not swap anybody out for that first practice session. Every other step applies to every practice session. Before the session begins, you can do a bit of a pre-flight check. First, you'll want to choose a tire compound for each car. Remember that lap times and pace don't really matter here. Sure, they can have an impact on how quickly a car can return to the pit, technically speaking, but the benefit there is marginal. At the same time, you want to make sure that tires don't get worn down too much when driving, as beyond a certain threshold, cars are forced to return to the garage, and that means you can't continue to gather feedback even if you wanted to. So you might want to go out with the mediums or perhaps the hards. They're a bit slower around the track, but they last longer, and you can use any one of them for multiple stints, especially the hards. Now, I like to use hards to begin with, as if you don't use them in P1, you might not have access to them for the second or third practice session because they get sent back to the manufacturer after the first practice session. It's just one of the regulations of the sport. If you want to swap car parts out, the third practice session is the absolute last chance to do so, but keep in mind, swapping car parts out reduces your driver's familiarity with the car. So you'd like to do that swapping before the weekend begins, ideally, or if you forgot and it's last minute, you want to do it before that first practice session so that they're able to regain that familiarity over the course of the 3 practice sessions. But perhaps most importantly, especially for today's video, you'll want to pay attention to the car setup section. Even before the first practice lap, your race engineer and driver have some idea as to what they prefer, highlighted by the blue ranges for each aspect, and there is absolutely no need to drive that first lap without having made adjustments here first. We'll discuss what each element does in the next section, but for now I just wanted to highlight that your initial setup should be adjusted for both cars individually, and you should note that each car will need to be adjusted in its own way. Your drivers have different preferences and driving styles, and so they'll want slightly different setups even if the cars are exactly the same otherwise. Do not mistakenly assume what works for one driver will work for the other just the same. Something I like to try and do for the first stint out is adjust the sliders in a way that matches the track while staying within the staff and driver's recommendations. For example, this track looks to have very few pure straights and it's got quite a few corners. We can even see that cornering is considered to be quite an important attribute for the car on this track. So with that in mind, I'll try and tweak the initial setup in favor of cornering, again, something we'll get into in more detail in the next section. A safer way to do your initial setup is to try and set things as close to right down the middle of the blue recommended ranges for each aspect. Next, you can set your run plan. I like to keep it between 15 to 20 laps, as you can always call a car in earlier if you want to, but you cannot keep it out for longer than what you set here. Finally, under driver options, I would keep pace and fuel usage low to reduce wear on the tires, preventing stints from being forced short because of tire wear, and to reduce wear on your engine too. That's an expensive part to replace between races, and even more expensive to have die on you in the middle of a race. With all that in place, you're ready to actually kick off practice and wait for your first round of feedback. But before that, let's discuss the parts, what they mean, and the order of operations. The front and rear wing angles of the car determine, among other things, how much downforce the car experiences as it pushes through the air. Downforce literally forces the car down onto the track, keeping its wheels firmly on the track surface, changing the force interactions happening between the tires and the track, which is particularly important for when cornering. This extra downforce is excellent for turning at higher speeds, but you'll see a negative impact on the car's speed when driving on a straight because of the increased drag caused by the same angle of the wings that provides this increased downforce. So, by adjusting the wing angles, you're balancing a preference for a track with a lot of corners and short straights versus a track with fewer corners and longer straights, where you want reduced downforce and, as a result, reduced drag. So again, succinctly put, for a track with more corners and shorter straights, you want more downforce, which you get with higher wing angles, but for a track with fewer corners and longer straights, you want less downforce, which you get with lower wing angles. Anti-roll distribution further impacts how the car behaves during turning, and it's represented as a ratio comparing rear to front bias. More of a rear bias is better for tracks with more cornering, and more of a front bias, obviously, is better for tracks with less cornering. Tweaking tire camber adjusts how flat the tires sit on the track when driving, and a more negative camber allows for better cornering, while a less negative camber is better for straight line speeds and getting more traction. Toe angle adjusts how straight the tires are facing when looked at from the top down. 0 degrees means the wheels are pointing straight forward, but by increasing the toe outwards, the wheels start to point away from the car. Now, maybe this is my lack of understanding, but I always assumed a higher toe out means better cornering, but as per the game, a higher toe out actually works against cornering and is better for brake stability. I'm not sure what I'm missing here, but if you know what's up, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Either way, what the game says goes, so adjust accordingly, of course. Wing angles impact every aspect of the car, some more than others, but that means you typically want to start by adjusting the wings to set up your broad strokes. They're also the only factors that impact straights, with the rear wing angle having the biggest impact on the straights, so keep an eye on straights especially as you adjust your wings to make sure it ends up where you want it to, as nothing else you adjust will shift it around. Next, you want to adjust anti-roll distribution to further fine-tune everything but the straights attributes. As you'll see, anti-roll distribution will give real big step adjustments to traction, so keep an eye out for that. Next, tire camber adjusts everything minus straights, but does so at a more granular level. Now you're really fine-tuning things. And finally, adjust toe out as your last item, since it only focuses on braking stability and cornering and very barely adjusts where they sit. You'll sometimes need to go back and forth to make adjustments, but this is typically the fastest approach to go from broad strokes to granular adjustments. But what happens when you actually get feedback? Adjusting with feedback. Alright, so you've sent your car out with its initial setup, it's done a handful of laps, and thanks to the quality of your race engineers, your drivers have accumulated feedback. Since your primary purpose in this example video is to fine-tune the car's setup, you want to call your cars back to the garage as soon as the feedback counter hits 5 out of 5. Do not pull the trigger on this too early. 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, anything less than 5 out of 5 means you'll have missing information, and as a result, any adjustments you make will involve an element of risk that you could have easily avoided. This is why it's also important to set up for longer stints so you can choose when to call a car in rather than be forced in due to a lack of fuel. And this is why it's important to make sure your tire wear doesn't force a stint to end too early either. Again, a driver will come back to the garage without a full 5 pieces of feedback if the tire wear crosses the threshold I keep mentioning. So, assuming all has gone optimally, the driver and race engineer get 5 pieces of feedback together, and then you call them in. Once they arrive back at the garage, you can reconfigure their setup, and you'll see a few things appear different on the screen now. For one, the blue bars that represent the optimal ranges will have shrunk, representing your driver and engineer figuring out more closely how they'd like the car to behave. It doesn't matter how close you were with your previous setup, as the bars will always shrink just the same. Where your previous setup does matter is in the more specific confidence feedback you get, as you can use driver feedback to get an idea of how close you were to the optimal setup. If it says optimal here, for example, it means you want to maintain that aspect exactly where it was. If it says great, it means you don't want to shift it by too much, and good means you can shift it a bit more in either direction, whereas bad might mean you're at the completely wrong end. The 5 pieces of feedback collected during a stint represent each of these 5 aspects of the car. For each piece of feedback collected, you'll get an assessment, and for each piece of feedback missing, you'll get question marks for an aspect and no idea if that specific aspect felt good, great, bad, or optimal. So, as the feedback comes in, remember how the different tweaks shift these aspects around and fine-tune accordingly. One thing I like to do is make more drastic changes in the first 2 or 3 stints while keeping a track of the best results for each aspect individually. Note that the game's marker for what's best in green shows the best combination, not the best spot for each aspect individually. So if overall confidence is better at the cost of worsening confidence with a specific aspect, the worst spot will be marked as best, only because of the overall confidence being higher at that location. That means if you found an optimal spot for one aspect, you should make a note for yourself where the marker sits. Take a picture, take a screenshot, or go analog and trace your screen. Whatever you decide to do, figure out a way to mark exactly where that setup was placed so you can recreate it later. Then, you can focus on finding the optimal spot for others while ignoring how it impacts the one you've already figured out. Then, when you found the optimal points for each aspect, or great points for each aspect if you're running out of time, you should adjust the setup to line up with the notes you took across the board as closely as possible. and then you'll have the best setup that you've been able to figure out over the course of practice. Alternatively, you can do what normal people probably do, which is once you find something in the optimal zone, you do your best to keep it there while you fiddle with the other settings while keeping it there as closely as possible. Anything in the great zone you adjust marginally, and anything in the good zone you adjust with a bit more freedom, and anything in the bad zone you try pushing in the complete opposite direction until you narrow it down. Again, if something has gone from good to great between two stints, that means you're a step closer to optimal. If something has gone from great to good, that means you've tweaked it in the wrong direction and should shift back towards greatness and, ideally, an optimal setup. Whichever approach you take, ideally you've got there before the end of the second practice session, and you can spend the third practice session focused on track familiarity and marginal adjustments to take confidence from great to optimal where needed. But if it takes you longer and you're still tweaking setups in the third practice session, you need to keep in mind that you only get the additional points to your driver's performance bonus if they're able to accumulate all 5 points of feedback on the last tweaked setup before the third practice session ends. Do not under any circumstances edit your setup before the last stint in the third practice, especially if there's less than 20 to 30 minutes left. If your driver doesn't come back with all 5 pips of feedback the last time you send them out after having made adjustments, you will have lost all your hard work. Even if their setup confidence would have been at 100%, it doesn't matter. They have to have come back with all 5 feedback pips the last time you adjust their setup. You can send them out again, but don't change the setup. It's also worth noting that a setup confidence of 98% is all you need to get the maximum number of bonus attribute points from setup confidence. You can see here, just as a quick example, how a 100% setup confidence did not matter since the feedback wasn't collected before the end of practice session 3, leaving all those bonus attribute points on the table. Now you can still adjust the setup one last time before cars go out for their first qualifying stint, but after they leave the garage for their first qualifying stint, the setup is locked outside of adjustments to the front wing angle. If you've been keeping notes and referring to them to find each aspect's sweet spot, you should be getting 90 to 100% confidence with relative certainty, confidence of your own, and consistency. But please, don't forget to have a full round of feedback for your last setup at the end of practice session 3. I cannot stress this enough. I know I've repeated myself 3 times, but it is so important because the last thing you want to do is figure each aspect out to perfection and then leave all the benefits on the table because one last tweak left the setup confidence as an uncertainty at the end of practice, and as a result, you got nothing. But there you have it, all the literal moving parts behind getting an optimal setup. It takes some practice and a fair bit of patience, but optimal setups are a key reason you won't want to simulate practice. As mentioned earlier, an optimal setup can make a difference in qualifying and the race. If you have any thoughts of your own or any questions or strategies you'd like to share, drop them in the comments down below and I'll answer or discuss all I can. And if this video helped you out, consider hitting the like button as well. And geez, if the video really helped you out, maybe consider the super thanks option down below too. Either way, as always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.